Hi, this is Nate. And if you're watching this, it's because uh, I just released Sidekiq in Practice. It's my workshop and guide to scaling Sidekiq from 0 to 10,000 jobs per second. And I'm here with Mike, the original author of Sidekiq, the only author of Sidekiq. I say original like there was like some other author later. No, it was like Mike wrote Sidekiq. He continues to write Sidekiq, and uh, we're just gonna kind of chat to celebrate the release a little bit, and talk two old Sidekiq hands, share some war stories, and hopefully just chat a little bit. So thanks for doing this, Mike.
You're very welcome, Nate. Congratulations on today.
Yeah, thank you. Um, so first thing I wanted to ask you, and I can't remember if I've asked you this before or not, but how did you get the name? When was the moment it was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna call it Sidekiq?
Um, I I think I always thought of Sidekiq in working in tandem with Rails. I always think of Rails as serving the web requests, but then there's this whole other thing on the side which does work in the
Which kick
background.
stuff? Then it was Sidekiq. Got it.
And I always thought, well, if Rails is like the superhero, then Rails needs a Robin to its Batman or something like that. So I thought, it's sort of a sidekick. And and the other aspect, of course, was that I was thinking about um, search engine optimization and being able to find related materials. And so the easiest way to do that is some sort of misspelling. So you take a common word, you misspell it, and all of a sudden it becomes your brand.
So
And
there
so
was
that's what led to the misspelling of it.
no Sidekiq with a Q before, or ending in a Q before you.
Uh, there, not that not that I'm really aware of.
Wow, that's actually impressive. That's impressive.
Yeah.
Because you have sidekick.com, right?
No, I don't believe I do.
Oh,
I have
okay.
sidekick.org.
Oh, .org. Okay, okay, okay.
Yeah, and .com has, I think it's always been parked.
Yeah, okay. So you can get it.
And I've just never approached the person as it
Yeah, yeah,
to see if they were interested in selling it, how much it might go for. I might have done it, and it might have just been out of my price range or what I was
yeah,
comfortable paying. So,
yeah, yeah. When you were writing Sidekick initially, you know, you've told this story to me before. I can recap. Like you had a job. This was at the climbing or the outdoor company, right? Where you originally got the idea, or was that before that even?
I was at a consulting company called Carbon Five,
Oh, okay.
which is still around. They're still doing great work. They're based in San Francisco, but they have offices, a number of offices around the country. But I was working as a consultant for a startup that was called Manila, and they would aggregate all sorts of banking and financial information. And to do so, you'd put in like credentials, which is horrible for security, of course. But they would go and log into all your accounts and scrape all the data.
Oh,
And they did this through background workers, background jobs. And at the time, they were using Java, JRuby, and Rescue.
hmm.
And it was horribly inefficient. It just took
Hmm.
up
I actually
an
didn't know that.
obscene amount
So
of memory.
the initial inspiration was a JRuby installation. I thought the story was that you were working in Java on some like unrelated thing, like not even Ruby related, and you're like, hey, Java has threads. That's a good idea. But it was actually a JRuby application the first time.
Yep, and they were using Rescue to do background work. But of course, Rescue has the exact wrong
Yeah.
model for Java and
Huh.
JRuby. So I thought, I could make this system 10 or 100 times more efficient by moving to a threaded working system. And I also realized that Ruby didn't have anything like that because people were constantly afraid of thread safety issues.
Yeah.
So I
Because this was
thought, well,
what year?
this was 2011. And
And did we
then
even?
in,
I mean, that was like back when you had to call. What was it like? Thread safety mode in your config in a Rails app, right? When Aaron had added that thing, it was like in your
yeah, like,
config environment, it was like config.threadsafe bang, right?
yep,
Like
yep,
take me off the not thread safe code path, like put me on the thread safe one, right? Like there was a switch.
yeah, exactly. And in fact, Sidekiq highlighted a number of Rails thread safety
I'm sure you
issues
did. Yeah.
that first year, and in fact highlighted thread safety issues in a bunch of gyms. But my understanding is that it was the primary driver
Mm.
in forcing thread safety in the Ruby community.
Yeah, because we didn't make.
Until Sidekiq was rolled out widely, threading wasn't really used broadly in the
Yeah.
Rails community. Delayed job, rescue, they were all process based.
Yeah, we didn't make Puma the default web server on Rails until Action Cable, which was Rails 4, I don't something like that. I don't remember, but that was quite a bit later. That was like
Right.
2015, 2016 or something. So, when you were writing it, did you consider any alternatives to Redis being the data store at the time? Like, was there anything else that was like, oh, maybe I could try whatever, or was Redis just the thing on the shelf at the time at this company? It was like, oh yeah, we got Redis. Okay, I'll just use that.
The issue is that there was no real data stores that were extremely efficient for queue-based operations. MySQL and Postgres at the time didn't have queue support. And Postgres added queue support and really improved their queue support a few years later. But in 2012, there really wasn't any data stores that were sort of having these, as you pointed out on Twitter this morning, order one operations, which are really efficient for lists and queues. And so Redis, so I kind of followed quickly in the footsteps of Rescue. Rescue kind of blazed the trail by using Redis for its queue implementation. And my primary driver was making the work multi-threaded. And so I looked to Rescue for a lot of inspiration as to how to implement this stuff. And the main innovation that Sidekiq brought initially was just the multi-threading.
And speaking of that tweet, so that was just me pointing out this morning that so Sidekiq uses three Redis commands really in the hot path of most Sidekiq jobs. And on the what are the two on the addition when you're adding to the queue?
Well, it L pushes or R pushes, I forget which. It pushes an element onto the list, and then it adds the name of the queue to a set.
That's it.
Which is the set of known queue names, and then the web UI uses that. So unfortunately, it'd be nice if that set add wasn't necessary, because it's repetitive, it's redundant work a lot of the time, most of the time. But it's pretty efficient. So
Yeah, I
it
noticed
turns
when
out
I
it
was
doesn't
reading
add
the
too
code,
much overhead.
there's no if statement there. You just always do it.
Yeah,
Because I
exactly.
guess to do the if, right, you would have to add another command to go check, which would
Yeah,
then
that would
just
involve a round trip.
yeah,
It would involve a round
which
trip.
would
So it's better just to do it, just fire and forget it.
yeah. And on the um, consuming side, it's BRL pop will push. Didn't you just change that as well? Like, or you were gonna change that to something else? Am I
Well,
making that up?
it's always Sidekiq has always used BR pop. Uh,
Oh yeah, not push.
and Sidekiq Pro obviously has the super fetch, which
Right,
uses a more reliable mechanism, which uses what is it, LPOP R push or something like that,
right, right. That's what I was
um,
thinking.
to ensure that the job stays in Redis, and so that it stays persisted
Hmm.
until it is done and can be removed.
And was this like and so the yeah, and then to wrap that up, so the tweet was about how those three commands, not the Sidekiq Pro one, but the three in Sidekiq OSS, those are all O of one operations. So that means that they work in constant time. They will always be the same speed, no matter how big the queue. It will always just work the same way, which is great because then there's no negative feedback effect of like, oh, my queues are getting really long and now my Sidekiq is getting really slow, and like queuing is really slow and taking stuff off the queue is getting slower. That can't happen. It's the same speed no matter how big that queue is.
Yeah, it's really important to pay attention to algorithmic complexity so that you don't get a downward spiral. right?
Yeah.
Like you say, you get more and more data, and things become more and more slow, and you're digging a hole effectively, and you need to stop digging the hole and climb out.
Yeah.
So yeah, that order one operation is those are pretty important.
And did you know that? Like, has that design always been the same? Is that the way it started in Sidekiq 001, or was that
Yeah,
something that
in
you
fact,
had to figure out later?
no, that's how it was always done, and in fact, that's the way Rescue worked. So I basically just copied the way Rescue worked, and that's why 6 months after I shipped Sidekiq, and I realized, hey, wait a second, there's a reliability problem here, and I started implementing a more reliable means of
Hmm.
fetching.
Hmm.
That's why that became a commercial feature rather than just part of the open source, because the open source package just copies the way Rescue works. And
Hmm.
so I spent you know months developing the reliability uh, fetching. In fact, I think I had three different iterations of the
Hmm.
algorithm, because it's just so difficult, because
Hmm.
Redis doesn't have um, a native reliable mechanism for pulling from multiple queues. That's the key. You can reliably pull from one queue, but you can't do it from multiple. And Sidekiq has to support multiple queues.
Hmm.
So I had to implement my own, which turns out is quite difficult.
Hmm. Hmm. Is that the most difficult, like, Redis based feature that you shipped since 2011? Like, I'm thinking about locks, scheduling, uniqueness, all the other stuff that you've shipped in Sidekiq that works, with basically as a Redis feature. Like, is
I
that?
mean, there's been a number of difficult features that I've had to do. The rate limiting, the various rate
Hmm.
limiters, the
Yeah,
concurrent
that's what I
rate
was
limiter,
wondering. Those
the
look
leaky
tough.
rate limiter. Those are all non-trivial.
Yeah.
Oftentimes it's only a day or two of actual sitting in front of a keyboard, writing tests, and just implementing things so it works. So it's not like it takes months to do this stuff, but it really does. You just have to sit down and actually do it, and it can be hard. And if you can't figure out, an edge case, or you can't figure out why something's going wrong, it can be uh, difficult and a little depressing trying to push through that wall. But yeah, like for instance, Factory, my other background job system, has throttling, queue throttling, which Sidekiq does not have. And so that was another difficult feature to implement in the same way, that it just took a lot of Lua work, and a lot of debugging, and a
Hmm.
lot of thinking about various edge cases.
Have you found yourself pulling from, like, other projects or sources of inspiration, like, other than Rescue, then as you've been building out more and more? Do you look at other people over other people's shoulders and be like, oh, okay, I wonder how such and such is doing this?
I mean, oftentimes when I'm when I have an idea for a new feature, I'll sort of do a review of the current systems that are out there, current code bases, see, what are they doing? Um, how are they doing this? But I always, start afresh with my own code, of course. But it gives me different directions to go, than things to think about. Um, so for instance, in the cron implementation, there's an API to define the jobs. You don't define the jobs in YAML in a
Hmm.
file on the file system. And that was a conscious design choice. I
Hmm.
looked through various gems, and some of them load the crons from a separate YAML file.
Hmm.
I decided not to do that for whatever reason, but that's the kind of design decisions that you make when you're sort of seeing what else is out there, and
Hmm.
who else has solved this similar type problem.
Hmm. So one of my, I don't know if it was maybe the first time I used Sidekick was in 2013 or 14 or so, and I was working at it was a coffee subscription box was the company, and we had Sidekick to do some stuff, and we were at the startup accelerator, and the people behind me at the startup accelerator was Customer IO, which is still around, Colin Naderkorn and co. And I remember turning around and looking at their Sidekiq dashboard and looking at the number in the top left and being like, "Oh my God!" And I know they were kind of one of the first bigger installs in Sidekiq. So it's been 10 years since you originally released Sidekiq. Like, what is like the biggest, craziest install that you're aware of in terms of like jobs per second? What is like, you don't have to say a name, but like if you got a jobs per second number, like
Yeah.
what's the craziest stuff you've seen?
Well, okay, so I've heard of so the number 50 comes to mind because I've seen 50 billion in the job processed counter. And I've also heard of, I haven't seen it, but I've heard of installations doing 50,000 jobs per second
Wow.
across all their shards.
Yeah, sure.
So it some of these numbers are an order of magnitude higher than I ever would have expected Sidekiq to be used. So,
Yeah.
and that's the life of an open source project. Is you're going to find that no matter what you think, people are going to use it at 10x what your grandest fantasy might be. So. Uh, Sometimes you're just honest with the people and you're like, I had no idea it could scale that high. And other times you're just like, there's no way I'm going to support that. You're on your own. But yeah, that's when people start building their own systems on top of yours, or they start tearing out pieces of what you've built and building their own custom implementation, just because they can start whittling away at the dead weight that is costing them a lot in terms of throughput and performance, because they just don't need that feature, and they need that ultimate throughput to scale.
Did you get like feedback when you were, you know, in 2012, 2013 from, you know, big installs that were like, "Hey, this thing is not working," or like, "Man, I really wish it did this." And like what were there like cracks that were exposed or things that needed to get implemented based on like people that were these kinds of trailblazers, you know, that were
Yeah.
putting out billions of jobs?
There have been people who have submitted performance tweaks, who have rewritten bits and suggested algorithmic improvements to scale further, for sure. Um, but one thing I've tried to do is always keep open the um, emergency escape hatch of sharding, right?
Hmm.
So Sidekiq 3, I think it was, added sharding support. So now if you've reached the ultimate scale of one particular Redis, you can just simply roll out more shards and scale horizontally. So that's really the answer is you can always optimize vertically, so that your vertical scale, but at some point you just run out of CPU cycles, and so being able to scale horizontally and vertically means that you can effectively scale infinitely. So that's what I've always tried to keep in mind. Um, will this hurt or help with sharding?
Mm-hmm. Do you find any kind of things that that you've over the years added, changed, maybe uh, removed based on conversations with customers that you're like, oh, people keep screwing this up, or everybody's
Yeah,
asking me for such and such? What are did any thing come out of those kinds of
that's a
conversations?
that's a really good question. um, have I removed stuff? Have I removed APIs? Um, well, let me give you an example of what I'm doing right now. So Sidekiq 6.3 will be coming out reasonably soon. Maybe for RubyConf. Maybe I'll launch it in a couple of weeks for RubyConf. But it adds a new module, Sidekiq :job. So just like you have active job base, you'll now have a module, Sidekiq job,
Hmm.
which it's an alias for Sidekiq worker. But the industry, the Ruby ecosystem, has chosen the word job. Whereas, Rescue used the term worker, so I just borrowed the term worker. But it turns out that was not a great idea. The word worker is too nebulous. People use it in various different contexts to mean various things. And so I've just deprecated worker, period. So in 6.3, we're going to introduce this Sidekiq job. So now you can include Sidekiq job in your classes rather than include Sidekiq worker. And so that's an example where I'll probably never actually drop Sidekiq worker, but I'm going to change all the examples. I'm going to change all the documentation, because using the right words and naming things correctly is really important for people's understanding. And when we talk about jobs, you should be able to point and say, this is my job class, and not, oh, this is a worker class that sort of implements a job. And in Redis, we call it a job, but it's a worker class, and then you instantiate it to execute a job. And
yeah, it's got a job ID.
It's just very confusing. So so what I've been telling people is just simply drop the word worker. Call it a process. I start 5 Sidekiq processes, each have 10 threads, and they execute these 4 jobs. And notice you're not using the word worker at all there.
Yeah.
And that will make things a little clearer. So that's an example of where I've been sort of guiding the community to improve things.
Is there something that people keep asking you to add that you don't? That you're like, no, I'm never going to do that. Other than the easy answer here is you'll never support a database other than Redis. We've heard that one for the last 10 years, I think. Every podcast I used to, especially in the beginning when Sidekiq was becoming popular, it's like, so when are you going to support Kafka? And it's like, no, I'm not going to do that. But like, is there anything else that was like, you keep getting asked for, and you're like, you don't think it's a good idea, so you don't want to support it, or any other reason? Like, oh no, I'm just never going to implement that.
Yeah, people have asked for throttling a lot. Like, I want to be able to just guarantee that only 5 jobs per queue are processed at a given time.
Yeah.
And
Which you have
that
with the rate limiters, though, right?
Well, the rate limiter limits your calls to a third party. It
Oh,
doesn't
right.
limit. It doesn't
Right.
limit the rates that you fetch jobs from Redis.
Right. Sure.
And so the issue there is that would make fetching from Redis a lot more complex.
Yeah.
And complexity breeds slowness. It breeds performance issues. And so I've always told people that you can use a rate limiter, of course, but you can tune your concurrency, and you can point a single process at a single queue with a specific concurrency.
Yes, that's
And
exactly
that
what I
way,
tell people too. Yeah.
and that way you limit your throttle the queue just naturally, and without any performance overhead.
Yep.
Factory, again, my other background job system written in Go, it does implement throttling because it has a different architecture. And that architecture allows throttling without as much overhead, because Factory is a single point of entry in front of Redis. Sidekiq doesn't have that proxy in front of Redis. Sidekiq talks directly to Redis. Whereas with Factory, your workers all talk to Factory, which can implement the throttling in one place, right? So that's why the 2 different systems, sort of just naturally allow different features based on different architecture.
What do you think is like what are the big support questions that you get asked when people's sidekicks like start to grow and like fall over? Like people come at you with emails of like, hey, we're selling NFTs over here and Sidekiq's growing like crazy and it keeps falling over. What do we, what are the kinds of problems that people come to you with?
The main problems that people get into are oftentimes constructed themselves. They've created their own problem. I'm thinking things like rate limiting. Like they want to limit themselves to 10 per second.
Yeah. And they come to you with that question, right? And then you ask them like, well, why do you want the rate limiting? Like, can we fix that problem, right?
Right. and so, and then I tell them, well, if you create 10,000 jobs and you want 10 executed, what's going to happen is Sidekiq's going to pull 100 jobs off the queue every second, and then it's going to hit and it's going to execute 10 of
Yeah,
those, but then
right.
90 are going to hit the rate limit, and then they're going to
Exactly.
reschedule, and it's going to cause a huge fracas within Redis, and a lot of overhead. And exactly to your point, what you really want to do is fix that speed bump on the other side so that you can execute 50 per second instead of 10 per second. So yeah, oftentimes it's just concurrency, it's throttling, um, and then
That's
people
good. I
want to
mean, I
know.
feel like that's a good sign that like the problem that people run into when scaling Redis is like, oh, or scaling Sidekiq is like, oh, it's too fast. Like I'm pulling jobs too quickly. Something else is breaking. Please make this not so fast.
It's been years since I've had people ask me a question like Sidekiq is too slow.
Hmm.
Like it just doesn't happen. It's invariably they're using the database wrong, in which case it's a Rails and an active record issue. They're using my features in such a way that, like I said, with rate limiting, that just it naturally leads to some big slowdowns. So yeah, Sidekiq itself is tuned pretty darn well, so that it itself is typically not the source of problems.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you and I have both had with basically, I guess, is that fair to say? I think it is that we both run the biggest multi-threaded projects in Ruby today. And so over the last 5 years, really, we've both had a lot of stuff with people. Oh, I have a memory leak, right? I have a memory leak in my Puma or my Sidekiq, right? And then we took us a while to figure that out, I think. But like, it's basically this Ruby's fault. This interaction with the memory allocator, and we get that a lot in Puma as well. Like, I don't. Maybe you get this too, actually, because I think one thing I've noticed is that when people get a stack in front of them, they look at the bottom line of that stack and then they're like, this must be your problem. Like, oh, like Puma is the number is the top of my stack. So like I'm gonna report this to the Puma issue tracker. And it's like, no,
Yeah,
no, 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 no. Look at the other side of the stack. Like the top of the stack is what you care about because that's often active record or whatever.
yeah. The one support issue I got this morning was from a fellow who said, uh, our database pool is set to 20, and we've found that in our Sidekiq processes have 90 connections. What's wrong? And my initial response is, well, Sidekiq doesn't know anything about databases.
Mm,
So, I and second of all, I don't know anything about your app. So it's not Sidekiq's fault, and I can't help you track down
mhm,
what's wrong with your code or the application code that's causing the issue. But yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of my support load is I have database connection problems.
mm,
I have my process is crashing, or I've got way too much memory.
mm,
I've got memory bloat. So what do I do now? Now, regarding memory, you have been huge in improving that situation with Ruby, with Malik Arena Max, with JE Malik. Um, that the community has just widely adopted both of those things, and it's really helped. So, I remember 10 years ago, memory bloat was just omnipresent, right?
yeah,
Every single production system had memory bloat.
yeah,
And what everybody did was just set a 24-hour daily cron job to restart your process,
yeah,
right? So
yeah,
that's what we did. So our sidekicks would restart every morning at 2 a.m. or whatever,
yeah,
and and that way memory bloat and memory leaks generally weren't a problem.
yeah.
Uh, but yeah, it's not something that I can really solve. And I try to teach people, the best tools and techniques for tracking this stuff down to improve things. But ultimately, the answer is in a different castle. It's not here.
Do you think that there's like things that you see that people seem to just like different people keep trying over and over that just never works? Like people come to you with like, "Hey, I'm trying to do such and such." and you're like, yeah, you're the 300th person to come to me that's tried to do that thing and it never works. So like, just don't do that.
The thing, the bad pattern that everybody does, or everybody tries, is the infinite job, the infinite looping job, where
Yeah.
they create a job and then the very last line of the job is schedule the next job for a
Mm-hmm.
minute from now. And they
Okay. So
do
what's bad
this.
about that?
Well, 48 hours, 72 hours, a week later, something goes wrong. There's this tiny network blip, and that job does not get in queued. And now you
Mm.
broke the chain, and now it stops
Mm.
running, and
Right.
you have no monitoring of it. And so all you do is you realize a couple days later, oh, this data for the last 72 hours has not been processed. Well, because my loop didn't or my loop got broken and didn't get rescheduled, and now I got to restart it manually again.
Well, I will raise my hand. I have definitely done that. I've definitely done that one. I think it was like a case where I didn't really care, like if it ever broke or something. But I've definitely done that in a pinch. Been like, all right, I'll just queue the next one.
Yeah, yeah, it's just people trying to implement cron jobs,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah,
If you just constantly want something done, then people will implement it like that, and inevitably it breaks.
yeah. Um, in in your mind, are there any ways that you can shoot yourself in the foot using what Sidekiq already provides? Like, what are the sharpest edges in Sidekiq that people cut themselves on all the time?
Oh golly, um, probably the hardest API to use correctly is the batch API.
Really?
It is, yeah. I mean, it's a reasonably complex API
Hmm.
to understand how workflows need to be designed, um, when to add jobs to the current batch dynamically, or when to create a new batch, or when to open up the parent batch, and because all these are all tools in the toolkit, the batch toolkit for building workflows. But it takes people months, if not years, to sort of grok the limitations and how things work. And
Mm.
the batch documentation is some of the most complex, um, and the examples are some of the most complex APIs that I've had to design. And it's one where I'm sort of half happy with how batches work,
Hmm.
but I do wish it had come out a little more intuitive. Um, yeah, it's something I'm super proud of because it's extremely complex internally,
Hmm.
um, but it can be difficult to use correctly, uh, and I just wish it had come out a little more intuitively.
Is there anything that like so I had a conversation with Sage Griffin about Active Record a while ago, and basically I asked them like it was specifically about how Active Record is just based around this lazy loading design, and we couldn't have n+1s in Active Record if it was strict all the time, right? Because you would just try to access something and it would blow up, and then you know. And we've added some strict APIs to Active Record in the last couple of years that basically implement that behavior on a case by case basis. Um, and I asked Sage, would it have been better if Active Record was strict all the time? And they said, we'll never know because it's too late at this point. It's too late to have that design choice has been made. It's not really worth thinking about what it would have been like if we hadn't done that. Is there anything that like you look at Sidekiq that you've shipped and you're like, this is too late. Like this isn't perfect, but I can't. I can never go back and change this. Like it's been 10 years. Like that API has been
Yeah,
out there for too long.
yeah. I'd probably, if I was starting over today from scratch, some of the APIs for creating new jobs, the worker dot perform async call is what everybody uses. However, I probably would have. provided a little more of a Ruby idiomatic API for creating jobs. Uh, not that I think the current way is bad, but I think active job has brought in some interesting APIs like the set method, which allows you to override options. And so I added that to the worker API, and that was a 100% a rip off of the active job API, because I saw this and I was like, hey, that's a great idea. I'm going to steal that and put it in Sidekiq too. So hat tip to them. I think APIs can always be improved. But more to your point, I see myself as a maintainer, as a shepherd. I shepherd these APIs through releases, through versions, through major version changes. I'm always looking to improve them. I'm always thinking about backwards compatibility and how can we, gracefully guide Ruby and Rails applications from the old APIs onto new APIs over time. And so, yeah, I'm always open to that, and I'm always trying to do that to provide better, richer APIs for people to use. So, I don't know if that answered your question, but that's part of just being a maintainer, is thinking about what is the current system and how can we improve that, and then how can we not leave people behind, but guide people to the new way of doing things that is, hopefully 100% better.
Hmm. That's that's a good wrap up. That was a perfect ending. I feel like we're going to the great sunny future of software.
I stuck the landing.
Well, thanks so much for talking, Mike. I really appreciate it. I always enjoy talking to you anyway about software. So it feels like I just put the record button on for one of our usual conversations anyway.
Right. Just two dudes hanging out, talking software.
All right. Well, thanks again, Mike.
Sure.